Hello and welcome to Hazard and Hope. I'm Ed, and in this episode of Our Flood Resilient Home, we're heading to the village of Reeth in North Yorkshire to hear from Reverend Hewlett about how the former vicarage was kept safe from flooding on a number of occasions by its flood resistance measures, and what unfortunately happened in 2019 when an intense rainfall event caused severe flash flooding throughout the village. This episode of Hazard and Hope is sponsored by Yorkshire Flood Resilience. Now, before we head over to hear from the Reverend, I think it's really useful to go through a bit of a timeline as to how the vicarage has been adapted to be more flood resilient and what some of the different consequences have been. In 1986, the property flooded severely as a result of Hurricane Charlie, but it wasn't until June 2008 that property flood resilience measures, such as flood barriers, were installed on the building, and that was 2 years after Reverend Hewlett moved in. And within 4 months of those measures being installed, they were put to the test by the September 2008 flood, and they worked. The deployable flood barriers and manual air brick covers around the vicarage helped to keep that flood water out. And 4 years on from that, during the 2012 floods, they were once again proven effective at helping to restrict that flood water from entering the vicarage. But in July 2019, Reeth and the surrounding areas experienced severe flash flooding, and a number of the flood resistance measures on the vicarage were unfortunately overtopped and breached. And so we're now going to hear from the Reverend about her experiences of this event.
The previous floods, it had been like a wet summer, It had been like this. We hadn't had a lot of rain. I had a student on placement from a vicar college staying with me, and I'd gone out and I took the washing in because it was spitting. And I came in and I jokingly said to him, "Oh, well, I won't be cutting the grass this afternoon. I can put my feet up." And 2 hours later, we were underwater. All the water just came down the bed, and it happened so fast that I think everybody thought it was just them. Do you know what I mean? It's going to be worth thinking what else was going on. But overall, there was about 100 properties affected. So it was huge. No warnings, because it happened too quickly for the flood warning people. And we've always had sort of flood drill, because we've had flood warnings and water across the garden most years. So flood drill is once the garden's covered, you move the cars up the hill, get the cats upstairs. And these are flood doors.
The actual door itself, or the
flood doors? They're like that thick, like submarine doors almost. They've got locking bolts. The cat flap was there because in theory it was above the flood level.
Oh, that's
So you used to have a bench so they would come up.
Oh, that's sweet.
But actually the water came in. It was the shed. The shed, we watched it float, and it ended up 2 fields away on a fence. The farmer brought it back on the front of his tractor the next day, and everything is completely dry. This is a flood door, but the weight of the water, which is above here, it was kind of there, the weight of the water pushed the bottom corner out, and that's how we flooded, basically. So, and yeah, this was another flood. This is one of those plastic flood shield things, but the water was above that. So the log floated and kind of burst that door open.
Oh, wow.
So in there, it looked like there'd been a tidal wave, everything had been picked up, sort of turned over and so on.
Yeah.
It was the force of it, really, and the sheer amount of it and weight of it and everything. This is a new drive because this collapsed after one of the floods. We realised it had been undermined. Came out one day, there was a big hole in it, so this had to be redone. Everybody had dryers in and heaters in and dehumidifiers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, here, all the floors were taken out, the plaster was taken off the walls, all the doors, windows, everything was taken out to dry out. So, it was pretty much everything from the ground floor just had to go out, because it wasn't just the water, it was the mud and the muck that came in with it. Yeah. And then, of course, there was this thick, sticky mud, so the Environment Agency sent diggers. They just scraped the topsoil off, so if you look at the grass, it's not on topsoil, it's just kind of growing through. People knew the vicarage flooded, so a lot of people were getting in touch and all keeping up on Facebook and stuff. So the first night, it happened about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so the first night we just stayed upstairs. We had no power, no running water, couldn't use the loo. Mountain Rescue came and checked on us, and the fire brigade came and checked on us, and we were sort of upstairs. The water did go down, but it left 6 inches of thick, sticky mud that was septic tank and animal waste and all kinds of really nasty, yucky stuff right the way through. I went to stay with a friend in the village for a few nights, and then I spent 7 weeks sofa surfing, which was basically staying with people around the village who were on holiday. I sort of fed cats and looked after houses and things. And then moved into a temporary home, which is a holiday cottage up Arkdale. Because it's a vicarage, I don't own it. And they talked for years about buying a new vicarage. and it kind of rather moved the conversation on. You know, it was, and there was a house that was very suitable and available, and that's what I've moved into. They bought it.
I suppose with your role in the community and working with people in that recovery phase, what was it like, and were you sort of touching on some of the floods during that phase with the work you're doing?
Initially, I mean, our doctor put out a very helpful sheet, and it basically follows a process. So initially, you're in survival mode. You're just trying to get stuff sorted. You're dealing with insurance people, you're doing like that. It can take maybe 6 months just to get to the end of that first phase. Then you start moving into a new place and realising what you've lost. For months, I went to cook something, realised I didn't have that bowl or that jug or that spoon, or, and you're forever ordering things or going out to buy things. And then I think you move on to the people actually sort of dealing with it emotionally and psychologically, I mean, I still dream about the flood. I know other people get very scared when it rains, or, there's thunder, that kind of thing. There's a chat group we have, and it only has to be bad weather, and that sort of lights up and gets busy. So people are still struggling with the sort of aftermath now, I think, of they're still getting the houses sorted, people are only just in, but the practical things, but also people now starting to deal with the kind of, how do I cope when it looks like it's going to flood and all of that, because it's quite scary once you've been through it. We were just very thankful nobody was killed or injured, it could have been much, much worse in that sense. But yeah, the community itself really pulled together, people really supported each other, made sure they knew where people were. So we had the big flood in July, and then if you remember, we had a very stormy winter with lots of storms, and there was one storm, Kiara, that brought a lot of water down, and this house flooded through again. They'd just cleaned out the floor voids and everything else, and it flooded through again after that. So
it flooded during the recovery phase.
Yeah.
And did that set them back on the...
It did, because they had to clean out the floor cavities again, but then they realised there was old asbestos, so then they had to get somebody in to do an asbestos removal. So that actually, it did put the recovery back. And the diocese had commissioned a guy to do a site survey. It basically said that this site is like an old-fashioned sink. It's higher on all the sides, and there's basically a plug hole right outside the front door. There's a limestone sinkhole. Wow. So, and that's the lowest point of the village. So just in there. So you can see that if there was a cloudburst in Reeth, it would come straight down the head for that. They looked at waterproof walls, they looked at waterproof gates, they looked at, putting a sort of internal wall around the dry stone wall that you could see, kind of thing, a bonded wall thing. Because the water actually came over the walls this time.
It's a serious wall that you'd have to build around this, but also if the water does get inside and...
You're stuck, aren't you? So, yeah, it was all from that river.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks like a little twiggly beck at the moment, but actually you only need a couple of hours rain and it'll go up a foot. Before the flood, there was an island that had grown up with trees on and everything, and that's been removed. And the rocks have all been moved to make banks and a wider channel, a flatter channel.
Whilst filming, we also spoke to the Reverend's former neighbour and heard that they'd actually got advice from the Water Board and other agencies before building their home to actually help determine what the best position and thresholds might be to set the building at.
So we built it above the highest recorded flood level. So in this flood, it right up, and they just got a wet doormat, but that was all. But yeah, I mean, the smaller floods, they just stay home, And
in terms of, I suppose, tips that you might give to anybody else who may have a property that's vulnerable to flooding?
Have a flood plan. Keep your valuable stuff upstairs. I mean, after our first 2 small floods, we moved everything that mattered upstairs. So actually this time I didn't lose photographs, I didn't lose valuable personal stuff like that. The only thing I lost was a few work files which are replaceable. So, anything that wouldn't be replaceable, keep upstairs. That's what we did. I'm glad we did.
Yeah.
And have a plan. We always thought, right, cats in. 3 cats, so cats in and upstairs. The other thing to do is take food upstairs when it's going to flood, because we didn't take any food up and we didn't have anything to eat or drink overnight. We took cat food. We didn't take our food. Make sure you have some Wellington boots or shoes or something that can live upstairs or take upstairs with you. So have a bit of a plan and then just do that, really. So think it through.
When you were living here, was there any particular things you'd do to kind of manage or maintain the different flood resilience measures, or
every year the flood company would come and check everything. So we made sure that other people knew when we had these are fixed ones, but when we had the kind of covers that you had to put over the flood, we made sure that other people knew where they were and how to use them. And we knew the fire brigade locally, the retained fire brigade, they knew where they were and how to use them. So hopefully we kind of covered ourselves if we weren't here, which happened on one occasion. Because I don't own the building, there was a limit to what I could actually do other than sort of talk about it and ask about it and make representation about it, really. And I mean, the diocese did take it seriously. They did put the flood defences on. I mean, these are pretty up to date, flood doors that are really thick and everything else. For me, I'd lived here 13 years, where I've lived longest in all my life, sort of thing, And to suddenly be out, that was it. I don't live it anymore. I think it's very weird.
Now, it's really kind of the Reverend to have shown us around and to have shared those experiences with us. I mean, it was clearly quite an emotional experience to come back to that house where she had lived for 12 to 13 years and to remember those events. And so I think it's particularly inspiring to see that kind of resilient mindset that the Reverend's had, and the way the community has actually pulled together and helped support each other through those different stages of recovery. But really, I think what we can take away from this is that flood resistance measures, such as the deployable flood barriers and flood doors that we saw on the Vicarage, can be really very effective at helping keep flood water out. And really, those measures saved the Vicarage from flooding on at least 2 occasions. But it is also so important to consider actually how a property can be made flood recoverable, so that if or when floodwater does come inside the building, then there can be minimal damage to the actual building's fabric and its contents. Because there are always going to be thresholds and points at which those flood resistance measures are overtopped. And so it really makes sense to have a diversity of strategies in place. And I suppose hearing about how the former Vicarage flooded during the recovery phase is quite a stark reminder of just how vulnerable our properties can be during the reinstatement process. But when it comes to adaptation strategies, I'd say we shouldn't also forget that there are avoidance-based approaches to property flood resilience. And that can be things like raising your floor levels, or as the Reverend's neighbours have done, actually setting the thresholds of their property at that higher level. Now, that's obviously easier to do from the outset, but in one of our forthcoming episodes of Our Flood Resilient Home, we'll see how Tim in Yalding has actually vertically adapted his property by adding an extra story to his house and changing the function of his ground floor zone. Really, I think there's a lot that we can learn from the insights and experiences that Reverend Hewlett's kindly shared, and I think it also really shows just how suddenly and sporadically these events can occur, and I suppose the actual damage as well that can be caused to the landscape around the building. I suppose what's really positive to hear is that there are a number of activities underway to help manage flood risk beyond the property level, with land and river management programs in the area. As there's a lot that we can do actually at the individual property level to make it flood resilient, but really flooding's an issue that needs to be addressed and managed at a variety of different scales. So thanks very much for listening, and if you yourself have a property that's been made more flood resilient and would be interested in having us share your inspiring story of adaptation as part of this series, then do get in touch.